Look around town, and you won't find many roads without asphalt. This black tar-like material makes up the majority of our modern road surfaces. It's durable, water-resistant, and fairly cheap to make. But asphalt wasn't always this common, and it certainly wasn't always black. In fact, for most of human history, people didn't have the technology to turn crude oil into the smooth black asphalt we think of today. So instead, they made asphalt out of whatever materials were available, like dirt, gravel, and sometimes even bones. The result was a bumpy, uneven surface that was far from ideal, but still an improvement over walking. As time went on, though, humans did eventually discover how to refine oil into asphalt. And when they did, they quickly realized that they could use the substance for more than just covering roads. That's why the world's first paved streets can be found in ancient Mesopotamia around 2500 BC, where people spread a thin layer of asphalt over the ground to prevent dust from kicking up. You might not want to walk barefoot on that, though. Even back then, there were plenty of things mixed into the asphalt to make it less likely to stick to your feet. In fact, these early Mesopotamian cities had many of the same issues with their roads that we do today, like cracks, breaks, and erosion. But overall, they got the job done. And while Mesopotamians were using asphalt around 2500 BC, they weren't the ones who invented it. In fact, the oldest evidence of asphalt comes from the shores of Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, where a natural deposit of asphalt had been used by indigenous people as far back as 4000 BC. But this asphalt wasn't paved. Instead, it was waterproofed with crushed stone and used to fill the gaps in reed boats. Across the world in the Middle East, people also started using asphalt around 5000 BC. But they preferred to mix it with other substances to make it harder and more durable. For example, one recipe from the ancient Babylonians called for equal parts asphalt and chopped up animal bones. They weren't alone. People all across Asia and Europe mixed asphalt with all kinds of things like bones, animal fat, hides, and sawdust to make what is essentially a very thick type of superglue. But despite being a strong adhesive, these early forms of asphalt were not exactly suitable for making roads, because they cracked easily and would often break apart in cold weather. For that reason, roads made from asphalt were rarely more than a few feet wide and were mostly used by pedestrians. They usually ran between important buildings and were sometimes covered with brick or stone, especially at intersections where there was a lot of foot traffic. But those fancy paved roads required lots of labor and resources. So the vast majority of cities relied on dirt roads. They were cheaper and easier to build, but also incredibly dusty and muddy during different times of the year. So the wealthy would cover their carts with wet cloth to keep the dust down, while the poor had to literally walk behind their donkey carts, sweeping the path ahead of them with a branch. But regardless of the quality of the road, long-distance trade was critical to the survival of most city-states. And while wheeled vehicles were undoubtedly a major advancement, you don't have to look far to see the wear and tear it took on the roads. Ruts and holes are ubiquitous features of ancient roads, which were often little more than tire tracks after years of use. Sometimes the ruts would be filled with stones or other debris, but sometimes they were intentionally filled with layers of small pebbles and dirt that were patted down to make the road smoother. However, the real breakthrough came around 3000 BC, when the Egyptians learned to pave roads with stones. At first, it was only the wealthy landowners who could afford to build paved roads to their estates. But soon it became such a prestigious building project that pharaohs had elaborate roads constructed throughout their empires so they could travel in relative comfort. Of course, some of these roads were still unpaved, like the 400-mile stretch that led north from Cairo to the Mediterranean. But others were completely paved with limestone flags. And to prevent large stones from rolling away, the Egyptians invented a rudimentary form of asphalt that they used to glue the stones together. In the 600s BC, the Assyrians even adopted the Egyptian technique of using asphalt to hold stones in place. But they improved on the design by adding sand to the mixture. This made the material more malleable and allowed them to fill cracks and repair damaged areas more easily. The combination of stones and asphalt turned out to be quite durable, which is lucky since the Assyrians built one of the largest networks of paved roads in the ancient world. And while they may have gotten the blueprint for the roads themselves from the Egyptians, the credit for inventing true asphalt goes to the Phoenicians. Around 1500 BC, the Phoenicians were a collection of city-states scattered along the Mediterranean. Their chief exports were purple, dye, glass, and above all else, asphalt. This valuable resource came from a natural deposit near the modern Lebanese capital of Beirut, and they shipped it all over the known world, including to Greece, Italy, and even the distant shores of Britain. The Phoenicians were so successful at harvesting asphalt that they almost completely depleted the supply by the time the Roman Empire rose to power. But Rome was able to get around this problem by conquering the island of Chios, whose inhabitants had discovered how to extract oil from rocks like limestone and shale, and that gave them access to a seemingly endless supply of asphalt. Now that they had a reliable source of asphalt, the Romans went to work paving the entire empire. In fact, if you're in Rome today, you can still walk down the original Via Appia, the first Roman road ever built. It was completed around 312 BC and was 175 miles long, connected Rome to the port city of Brindisi, and was originally paved with stones set in a layer of burnt brick and mortar. But over the next several centuries, the Romans improved on the design, replacing the stone and mortar with layers of concrete and topping it all off with a smooth layer of asphalt. These new roads were so well built that many stayed in use for hundreds of years, and you can actually find traces of Roman roads beneath modern roads throughout Europe. For the same reason, we've got the Romans to thank for the invention of the wheel rut, because their roads were so smooth. There was nowhere for water to drain, so it would often pool in the middle of the road. Over time, the weight of passing carts eventually caused the asphalt to crack and buckle, forming deep grooves in the road that eventually became standard features of European roads. But while the Romans loved to brag about their impressive network of roads, they weren't the only ones paving the way. In China, people had already developed a sophisticated road network by the 2nd century BC, complete with paved roads and paved shoulders. Unfortunately, these roads were largely destroyed by war and neglect over the centuries. But during the Tang dynasty in the 8th century AD, the Chinese began reconstructing their roads. In fact, one emperor commissioned a massive 4,200-mile road that stretched from east to west and through some of the most rugged terrain in the world. There were paved sections throughout the road, but oftentimes the road would simply be a packed dirt track. And the Chinese used something called a watertight mat to help stabilize the roadbed and prevent water from eroding the surface. These mats were made from layers of felt and hemp fabric, all interwoven with each other and held together with a thick layer of asphalt. Once laid down, the mats would be rolled out to squeeze out any air pockets, and then a layer of gravel would be added to the top. Finally, another layer of asphalt was applied on top of the gravel, which would be left to harden overnight. Despite their durability, though, the Chinese roads were still susceptible to cracks and breaks, and the local government was tasked with repairing any damage within a week of it happening. To prevent the roads from getting too bumpy, workers would frequently resurface them with fresh asphalt. In fact, they would often use leftover asphalt from other projects, like refurbishing old chariots. All that asphalt eventually paid off, though. The Chinese roads were so well built that they remained in use for centuries. For example, one section of the southern road from the Song dynasty is still in use today. Today, most of our roads are made of asphalt, but it's still not without its drawbacks. For one, it needs to be resurfaced every couple of decades, which is expensive and time-consuming. For that reason, some places are experimenting with alternative road surfaces like concrete and even glass. But until someone invents a better road, we'll still be trucking along in asphalt.